Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 31. I'm Steve Kwan.
I'm Matt.
BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent BJJ approach. Matt, how are you doing today?
I'm well. How are you doing, Steve?
I am also doing well. I ate a lot of carbs.
Yeah.
And I'm on like the reverse keto diet. I basically just eat carbs.
Yeah.
And then I just train jiu-jitsu a few times a week, hoping that will burn them all off. And it doesn't. But, then I'm getting a weight advantage. I don't have a weight problem. I have a weight advantage is the way I like to think of it.
Yeah, carbs are the best. Too bad they're the worst for you.
Yeah, it's literally just like turning into insulin, but, it tastes really good. So
I'm at a point in my life where if I have like a sugary treat, then the next day I basically have the equivalent of a hangover for the first few hours of the day, and I'm all achy and my joints are all sore. It's a really weird feeling.
You know what? I get that now too, and I don't know how much of it is age or just eating a cleaner diet, but if I drink alcohol now, even like one drink, I feel terrible the next day. Even before that, after the drink, I normally just feel awful. Like I feel dehydrated and gross, and I get a headache and I feel slow. I don't know. It's one of those things where the more you eat healthy, the less you crave the unhealthy stuff. And it gets to the point where eating the unhealthy stuff actually makes you feel bad, not good.
Yeah, I think it maybe is because we have the Asian flush alcohol gene. Although you don't get flush when you drink alcohol. I remember you used to be able to drink a bunch and it wouldn't really affect you too much.
Yeah.
Whereas I've always struggled to hold my liquor, and I go red after one or two drinks.
Yeah, alcohol tolerance is something that I've always had, but it just kind of makes me feel gross, especially as I've gotten older. I used to be able to drink a lot more, but I think the dangerous thing about any type of unhealthy stuff is that your body gets used to it, and it gets to the point where, I can sit down and drink 5 drinks and it's not even a thing, right? That's not good.
Yeah.
If your body is conditioned to the point where you can put that much garbage into your body and your body is just used to it, that's not a good thing. Whereas if you moderate more, you actually find you want less of that bad stuff because your body doesn't tolerate it as well, which is actually how it should be.
Yeah, and the moral of the story, alcohol is bad.
Yep, there you go.
Should be enjoyed in moderation.
Anyway, today we're talking about predictable responses. So this is a mental model that we have alluded to in the past, and I think everyone probably has some inkling of how important this is, but it's one of those things where someone can explain it to you and you conceptually understand it, but it's hard to apply in practice and it's hard to understand where you would really use it. So what we're hoping today is that we can talk a bit about the concept and then maybe give some specifics of how you would apply this and what kind of positions this could be beneficial to you.
Yeah, and it's a concept that's all throughout grappling, whether it's on the ground, in submission cases, standing up, takedown, grappling. It's predictable responses is everywhere, and it's something that you see people who have more of an understanding of jiu-jitsu start to implement this concept into their game, whereas if you're brand new, you're probably just trying to stay alive and you don't really know what you're doing. But as you get older, you will try to sort of create opportunities for yourself by creating attacks on your opponent, breaking their alignment. We're going to talk about that today, how you can sort of turn those into other opportunities.
Yeah, when you're brand new, the only predictable response is you're going to tap out. It's just a matter of how quickly.
Yeah, don't die.
Yeah. So in terms of what we mean when we say predictable responses, we're basically talking about creating an action that stimulates your opponent to create a reaction. And the idea is, if you know what that reaction is going to be, then you can pounce on it ideally before your opponent even knows that they've done it. Now, often when people talk about predictable reactions in the martial arts, this comes up a lot when you're talking about stand-up, like how you set up a takedown. You always hear wrestlers talk about, push-pull dynamics when you're doing takedowns.
Yeah, snap downs.
Yeah. In judo, a big part of getting kazushi is creating predictable responses. But on the ground, it is just as important, and it's something that everyone should understand you can apply into your game. At a higher level, and I'm not even talking about like black belt level, but anywhere beyond like first day white belt, predictable responses become important because once your opponent knows how to defend a triangle, it gets very difficult to just throw up a triangle on them and get it. So you've got to be much more diligent in your setup. It's less about how you just do a move, and it's more about making sure that when it is time to do the move, you've created an environment where that move has a high percentage chance of succeeding.
Yeah, and this is like, for example, in judo, you might see predictable responses with a judoka snapping down their partner's gi or creating different pushing and pulling, or they might incorporate their feet, start to use ashiwaza and try to create trips and throw off the footwork of their opponent. And what we're basically talking about here is sequences and how, to be an effective grappler, it's important to understand what the responses of your opponent will be in defense to, attacks that you launch on them. So always thinking ahead and thinking about what are the possible, the most predictable responses, usually like anywhere between 3 to 5. There'll be 3 to 5 options for your opponent to escape. And if you're aware of them and you see them coming and you can create some foresight there, then you'll be able to create way better responses and be way more accurate with your submissions, your takedowns, everything.
So the reason predictable responses are so important, I mean, hopefully it's clear what we're talking about now, but the reason why they matter so much is because, as we've discussed in prior episodes, being able to dictate the pace is ultra critical when you're sparring with someone. In fact, in a lot of situations, it is kind of the primary thing that determines who's going to win. Matt, I don't know about you, but sometimes I feel this. Like when I'm sparring with someone, if I'm the one dictating the pace, I can feel that I am, and I know I'm probably going to win. Whereas on the other side, if I feel like everything I'm doing is like a desperate reaction to what the other guy's up to, I know I'm probably going to lose.
Yeah, and if you're one of the higher ranks in the school, then you might get accustomed to rolling lighter because you are trying to use less strength and letting people work things on you, so you can actually train your knowledge of predictable responses. But if you can definitely make the mistake of being too passive, and then sometimes even a much lower rank who's very aggressive and very maybe possibly trying to pour it on a higher rank a little bit more, they might be coming in hot, and then you find yourself in some deep trouble right away. So it's important to also assess what kind of person you're fighting. So if they're coming in hot, then you know that you need to prevent them from getting an inch because they'll take a mile. Whereas if someone comes in passively, it's going to be more of a playful role.
That's a really, really good suggestion, because when I started to get more experienced at jiu-jitsu, I kind of realized that you need to turn the dial down a bit on the more junior guys, but I didn't know exactly how to do it. So what I would do is I would basically just sit there and let them do what they wanted, and then I would try to react to them. And the problem with doing that is after a few years, I realized I was training myself out of dictating the pace. Yeah. So it became a psychological thing where part of my game was to sit back passively and let the other person attack. And even to this day, sometimes I catch myself doing that, where I'm waiting for the other person to make the move, and that's not something you want to do in a combat sport.
Yeah, and I've made that mistake in competition before, and possibly being too passive or not having the confidence to be more outgoing, and I've definitely paid for it in matches sometimes. I think there's a difference between being a reactionary fighter and being a counter fighter. I would think that if you're a counter fighter, you're still good at dictating the pace, but you just specialize in reacting to your opponent's attacks. And then some people will just go in there and be very aggressive and always go hard and always try and take control of the match. Like a good example of that is like Gary Tonin or Nicky Ryan. And most of the guys from the Danaher squad have a mentality of pushing forward always and trying to get the finish, whereas a lot of players will sit back and try and just play little games, stall out a little bit, and acquire points.
Yeah, and when we're talking about taking control like that, we're not talking about trying to muscle or bully your way into control. It's more about not letting the other person be the one who is determining the action and you determining the reaction. That doesn't mean you need to be super speedy or super strong. It just means that you need to be constantly on the attack and making sure that you're the one who is controlling what happens in the fight. You want to be in a state where the other guy is constantly reacting to you and doesn't have time to take assertive action and do what he wants to do, right? You want him to always be defending what you're doing.
Yeah, I think Keenan calls this tempo. He refers to it as tempo, and sometimes the best way that I illustrate it to my students is I demonstrate like a standing pass, and maybe like a a bullfighter pass or a leg drag pass, something like this, where essentially the person on top is coming in and trying to create a dominant angle and get past the guard before your opponent can even get grips. Because if the person on the bottom doesn't have grips, by the time your partner's in knee on belly, you're purely in defensive framing mode. You've now gone into the third phase of guard, where you basically don't have a guard, and it's much harder to recover from this position, as opposed to if you were able to grip up first, set frames first, keep your hips at a good angle, then it's going to be you're going to be a lot more better shape on the bottom. So definitely when you're looking for tempo, you're trying to prevent your opponent from getting crucial things like grips that will allow them to dictate the pace.
Yeah. And as I mentioned prior, the way that I think of this is, if you feel like you are constantly reacting to what your opponent is doing and you're just scrambling to keep up and you're on the defensive, you're not dictating the pace. That's all that basically means. Now, hopefully that has convinced everyone how important it is to dictate the pace. But the question then is, how do predictable responses help you do this? Now, the main thing is, a lot of dictating the pace comes down to reaction time, right? It comes down to how quickly you can implement a game plan without having to wait and to stop and to think and to assess. And that's the reason why higher level guys tend to be so much more dangerous than junior guys. It's not because they're necessarily like they know more techniques or anything. It's because they've drilled and trained so much that just there's a lot of things that they're comfortable with and they're familiar with and they don't have to think about.
Exactly. They don't have to think about it.
Yeah, they've drilled these things right into their muscle memory. We talked earlier, Josh Waitskin calls that like form to leave form, where he talks about drilling something so much that you don't have to think about it. And Salo Ribeiro has talked about that too, how if you think, you die, basically. If you have to stop and think about what you're doing, that's a window of time where your opponent is going to be implementing their game plan and you're not. So predictable responses become important because if you know what your opponent is going to do, then you don't have to stop and think and wait to see what they're going to do. You can just immediately move forward with your game plan. This is why so many successful attacks like sweeps or submissions, normally they work not just by like throwing up the sweep or whatever, but by doing something to lead your opponent into a position where that sweep is going to be more effective. Most single techniques don't work in a bubble this way. So the reason why predictable responses are so critical is because they reduce your reaction time and they allow you to think ahead and plan ahead. Like if I'm just starting a match with Matt, then I don't know what he's going to do. He could do anything. And that means I've got to do a lot of thinking and I've got to be doing a lot of analysis because there are, effectively infinite things that could occur. But if I get the grips that I want and I move Matt in a certain way, I can reduce the number of options that Matt has and narrow down the number of things he's likely to do. So then instead of needing to think about a million things, I only need to anticipate 3 things. And that's a lot easier for me to work with mentally. I don't need to stop and think about that. And the more I can reduce my opponent's options, the more I can kind of channel them into the direction I want them to go, right? It's like a military strategy, where you try to route people through a narrow path so that you can control and fight them one at a time. And in fact, this strategy has been discussed in jiu-jitsu. I've heard it called funneling, where the idea is you progressively take away your opponent's options to narrow them into the game plan that you want them to play, not the other way around.
Yeah, because there's always going to be a way for your opponent to escape an attack. There's not one attack in jiu-jitsu that is foolproof or 100%. So it's important to just, first of all, come to terms with that there's never going to be a moment where you have your opponent and they don't have some kind of option. They might be too late to perform a technique, but there's always going to be a way that they can escape. So, and like you said, really reducing your reaction time, that only comes with, first of all, you need the proper instruction. I think an instructor that's going to teach you about things like alignment and levers and stuff like that, but also just time accumulated on the mats. I used to just say it was, that takes years and years, but you can see some of the jiu-jitsu fighters today, it really doesn't take years and years and years. With the proper instruction, you can really make amazing progress in a short amount of time. And you'll notice that this is sort of a trait of really high level grapplers, is they don't go for one technique. They'll set multiple techniques out and they're waiting for the right response so that they can capitalize on a reaction rather than, going into something, say it's guard passing, going in and expecting to get your guard pass on the first or second attempt. That at the highest level, especially, in the competition when there's so much on the line, that there's going to be, upwards and beyond 10 10 responses from your opponent. So it's going to take a lot at the highest levels to actually perform a technique. Sometimes it takes the whole match before there's finally a breakthrough and someone gets through. So
yeah. I mean, when someone has good alignment and they're aware of an attack, it's fundamentally a lot harder to pull off that attack, especially if they're well trained, right? I mean, I think everyone from day one understands that when you're drilling a move in practice, it might seem easy and effortless, but against even the most rudimentary resistance, that move can become really, really challenging to do. This seems to happen all the time where, you're drilling triangles or whatever in class, and it feels great and it feels like you really got this, but then as soon as you try to use it in sparring, even against a super junior person, it just doesn't work. And usually that's because you didn't set it up properly. It's because you didn't go into the triangle in a situation where the opponent's alignment was fully broken. And the way that you kind of get there is with predictable responses, right? Every time you make your opponent move a little bit, you create an opportunity for a little bit of space. We talked earlier about how a lot of the time single techniques are not very wise, but chaining techniques is together. So chaining techniques together often goes hand in hand with predictable responses. You know that the first move you do is probably not going to work, but maybe it'll loosen the guy's grip a little bit. So then you try a second move, and maybe that one won't work, but maybe it's wobbled the guy's base a bit. And then by the time you get to the third or the fourth move, now you're really starting to apply pressure, right? So a lot of the time it's not about doing one move, it's about using your first few attacks to create openings for the real attacks coming down the road.
And not only do you have to be able to, start to implement attacks to create reactions, but you have to be able to be aware of your opponent and recognize when they've done something that you're expecting, so that you can immediately implement another attack. So not only do you have to be offensive, but you have to be receptive to what your opponent's doing, so that you can make the correct reaction. And this is this is actually something that happens in really all sports. If you see it, if you watch striking, you're gonna see boxers and do feints and things like this, and send little mind games to their opponents. Or even a lot of the time I like to think about when I'm guard passing, using the footwork and the feinting of like somebody in a shootout situation in hockey, trying to fake out a goalie. It's almost the exact same thing. Using head movements and feints, you can really sort of play tricks with your opponent's mind. But definitely, I think the best reactions that you can get are the ones that break your opponent's alignment, because that just, we've talked about the score before in past episodes, where posture, structure, base, you each have those 3 points that make up alignment. Well, every time you do something that creates a reaction, ideally you remove one or two, or possibly even all of those elements of defense from your opponent. So always thinking about breaking your alignment, I think, is more important than just trying to execute moves, as we've discussed before.
Yeah, and that was a really good point about the importance of faking out your opponent, and something that it took me a long time to really get into my game. The problem is, it's very easy to telegraph your intent in jiu-jitsu, and this is a situation where you might be creating predictable responses that cue your opponent as to what you're going to do. Yeah. So a lot of the time, if you're having trouble, getting a triangle, well, maybe a big part of that is because your opponent knows you're going for a triangle. Yeah. So a big part of advancing your game is learning to get into these techniques without your opponent knowing that that's what's happening. Because even at a very basic level, at a white belt level, if you grab onto your opponent's arm and try to pull it from guard, they probably know you might be thinking about an armbar and they're going to defend. And at that point, it doesn't matter how well you go through the motions. If they have set up a defense to your attack, you got to understand when a door is closed to you. You also have to understand when a door is open to you, right? So a big part of predictable responses is to funnel your opponent into a few key situations where you know what the exploit is going to be, and then attack from there.
Yeah, and it's important to know that if maybe you're newer to jiu-jitsu and this is sort of a newer idea, and you're thinking about how you can be more of a finesse player, just remember that predictable responses don't require a lot of strength. A lot of the time, predictable responses require no strength and are literally just messages that you are sending to your opponent through body language, or through maybe a little bit of kazushi here, but you're actually trying to set something else up and you already have a trap waiting, and seeing those steps ahead, and really being able to sequence your attacks, maybe, like I said, upwards and beyond 10 times. That's when you really don't even need to use strength. You just need to know where you're funneling your opponent to, and then hopefully you'll beat them to their next defense sequence.
And sometimes creating predictable responses does not need to be as sophisticated as I attempt a scissor sweep and then I pivot to something else. It can be as simple as if I look at your legs, you're probably going to either consciously or subconsciously assume that I'm going to attack your legs. So a lot of the time, if you be wary of where you're looking, because your opponent will, I see this a lot when guys are doing stand-up. If I see two guys standing up and one guy is constantly staring at the other guy's feet, there's either he is completely telegraphing that he's going to do a shot, or he's really smart and he's faking the other guy out and he's going to do something else. So this is something that you can exploit, right? You can make your opponent think you're going somewhere that you're not just by where you focus your own attention, if you do it visibly enough.
Yeah, and with masking your intentions, make sure you do think about things like body language, like you were talking about, where your opponent's looking or whatever, but also stance, right? More apparent when you're on the feet, because stance really plays a factor, but stance also applies to even if you're on your back and your guard. What do your frames look like? What, are you in base? Do you have good posture? All that stuff. When you're standing, your stance dictates a lot of your intention. So if you have a really low stance, I can probably either predict that you're going to pull guard or you're going to try and shoot, right? So always trying to match your eyes with your opponent, I think, is a good tip. Like if you're wrestling with someone, try to keep your eyes below or at level with your opponent's eyes, because good wrestlers, that's sort of what you look for. You look to see what their level is at. And a lot of the time, a lot of the reactions they try and create aren't even ones where they're touching you. They could just be level changing quickly and feinting, trying to set up, trying to get you to sprawl or to commit to a defense, and then they're going to act upon the reaction. So if you ever watch high level wrestling, this is where you really see some explosive, predictable responses come without even contact between two athletes.
Yeah, I remember I was at a Carlos Gracie Jr. seminar one time, and one of the things he showed, which I thought was really cool, was he talked about how, one of the ways to get a single leg is fake a guard pull. If the guy thinks you're going to jump on him and then you immediately drop down low, his body is primed to go up and you've moved downwards. And the converse applies as well, right? If you want to guard pull, sometimes faking a shot is going to put the guy out of position for the guard pull. So just little twitchy responses that make the guy think you're going one way can open up doors in the other direction. Yeah,
we actually drilled this yesterday in class. It's funny you say Carlos Gracie Jr. It just goes to show how long this has been around for. But what rings in my mind when you describe this technique is the Mendez brothers. Mm-hmm. They're actually really good at it. It's basically an ankle pick from a guard pull fake using the collar grip. So if you and what we're realizing when we were drilling it is that you don't even need to really sell the guard pull too much. You just need to create the proper kazushi with the grip, and you need to change your levels in such a way that they believe you're falling back. And then once they react, you're able to shoot forward and get that ankle pick. It's it really doesn't require a lot of strength. It's more about the timing of it all and creating that reaction.
But that's a good point, how you don't want to oversell it, right? If you're overly dramatic about your fake guard pull or your fake shot, then it gives the other guy time to process and adjust.
Exactly. They might see that you're one thing we found is one of the guys was he was actually lifting his foot up and almost putting it on the hip, but then retracting it. Mm-hmm. But the more that he tries to sell that guard pull, the more time he's wasting, and the quicker the more time his opponent will have to respond and maybe grab his leg and get his quick 2 points, right? So,
it's one of those things where you need to do it fast enough that the other guy doesn't have time to think. It needs to be something that triggers an instinctual reaction.
Exactly.
If you take too long with your predictable response, then it gives your opponent's brain time to catch up, and that's not what you want, right?
Yeah.
And additionally, if you're slow, then that creates openings for your opponent, and then you might lose the tempo. You might be on the defense now, and maybe the other guy is dictating the pace.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So just to kind of recap, predictable responses, they're really, really important for dictating the pace, mostly because they allow you to through the process of tying techniques together, create openings that will progressively break alignment just a little bit here and there. Very few moves work the first time. And it's super important to mask your intention so that your opponent doesn't know what you're doing, because that's an example of you giving off a predictable response. Like the most common one is, if I try to armbar you, if I grab your arm directly, you know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Something that I was always taught, as a gi guy, is if you want to armbar the guy, grab him by the collar, because then that is a far easier way to armbar, because you still get the same level of control, but now your opponent is confused about what you're going to do.
Whereas you might be going for a choke.
Yeah. Whereas if you just grab the arm, it is ultra clear what's about to happen, right? So your opponent's defense becomes very straightforward. Another example of creating a predictable response that I personally love to do is attempting something, and if it doesn't work, making my opponent think I've given up on it, and then when he drops his defenses, immediately doing it again. I do this a lot with the Ezekiel choke, and it always works, where I go to get it, and if the guy gets like his hands up to defend, then I'll put in a good effort like I'm going to get it, and then I let go of the grips, and then he immediately drops his hands, and then I go and I do it again right away. Like this works a shocking amount of time, where you deliberately give it up, and then when your opponent drops their guard, you just take it again. Yeah,
it's funny. Jiu-jitsu is such a mental battle that there's these little mind skirmishes all throughout grappling. Like, maybe you're going for a choke, and then you squeeze, but you let it go or whatever, and let them think that they can get a little bit of room. But in that movement, maybe you're able to adjust your grip and get like a face crank from there or something like that. You're always able to play these little games. Even with your breathing, sometimes your opponent's really listening to your breathing, so you can like set certain tricks and things like that, and always listen to your opponent's breathing is, I think, a good way to sort of decide whether or not they're tired, whether they're uncomfortable, if their alignment's broken, or maybe even if a choke is working. If you hear gurgling, that's probably a pretty good sign that the choke is on in some way, shape, or form.
Or the guy is faking you, right? This is another strategy, is if the guy's got a choke that is nowhere close, but you start gurgling and making weird noises and panicking a little bit, he's going to put it on. And this is a good way to get people to burn themselves out, like if there's nothing there.
Yeah, man, little tricks are all throughout grappling. So,
yeah. So in terms of the types of predictable responses, they, in my mind, kind of fall into two categories. There are the physiological ones, which is like, this is just how your body behaves. And then
if you get pushed backwards, you're going to take a step back to compose your base.
Exactly. If you get pushed, then you're going to take a step back, and you're going to probably put some pressure forward to counter. If you get pulled, you're going to probably try to pull yourself backwards out of it. But then it goes beyond that too, right? We've talked about controlled breathing and staying loose. Like, these are physiological responses where your body, if it goes into fight or flight mode, you start breathing more heavily and
tensing up.
Then you start tensing up. And so the interesting thing is, when it comes to predictable responses at the biological level, some of these you can train yourself out of. And that can be very important to understand, because some of these predictable responses don't work in a competitive grappling environment.
Yeah.
Like tensing up, for example, or losing control of your breathing. These are bad things, but over time you can train yourself out of those. So in addition to the physiological responses, there are also the trained ones. And as I mentioned, sometimes this can be you learning to override the things that come naturally to human beings, but it can also be things that like you would never just know to do biologically. Like, we all know that if someone tries to triangle you, your first defense should probably be to try to posture up. Like, there is no biological reason why that would be obvious or intuitive to you, but through training we learned that that's the first thing that you should do. So there's kind of these two different categories of things, and you can exploit them both, right? One at the physiological level, but also understanding how a trained opponent is going to react. And sometimes you can actually mess with people by doing things that they don't expect. Like, we all fall into patterns about what you're supposed to do when you're doing jiu-jitsu, but sometimes if you do something that is completely unpredictable, it throws the guy off of his game so much that then he doesn't know how to respond, and that can be a good place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And just think of why, when someone who's brand new who walks into the gym, why it's so easy to do what you want to them. It's because you know what their predictable responses are going to be. They're going to be spazzing most of the time. They're going to be very rigid. They're going to be unable to control their heart rate and their breathing, and they're going to be fighting for their dear life. And a lot of the time they'll be doing really like silly things. Like, that newbies will give you their backs because they don't like the pressure straightforward. They'll they'll leave limbs exposed. And if you know, like if you can predict what someone's going to do and they're brand new, it's very easy to take advantage of them. And so it takes time to develop these sequential defenses and your understanding of what you're, getting an idea of what your opponent's going to do. And it explains why it's so easy to handle beginners.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember my instructor one time was teaching the somersault pass. And for those who haven't seen it, it is where you're in the other guy's open guard and you literally do like a somersault right over top of his face.
I wouldn't recommend it.
Yeah. Well, so
it's not
this
the greatest pass.
No, but this is what my instructor said is like, this is not a high percentage pass. It's probably not going to work, but it's worth.
That's what you should say before you teach a technique.
No, but what he said was it's worth considering because it makes your opponent think, right? Because your opponent is going to think, if this guy's crazy enough to try this, what else is he crazy enough to try? Right? There's some value to being unpredictable sometimes. I mean, obviously, you don't necessarily want to structure your whole game plan just around doing things for the sole reason that no one else does them. But sometimes by shaking it up a bit, you can kind of break people's mental patterns and their preconceptions of what you're going to do, and that can really screw up their ability to read your responses.
Yeah, and there's another side of predictable responses too that we haven't talked about. Like, say someone is, let's say I'm, reasonably high level and I have good leg locks, and then I go against someone who's like, pretty high level or decently high level, but knows nothing about leg locks. So it's very important that I understand the possibilities of what could happen if I get a leg lock on this person and we're in a training scenario. This person might not know what to do and they might spin completely the wrong direction. And if I don't have that in my mind where, I don't have my training partner's safety in mind, and I know what someone who's uncomfortable with these scenarios, what they might do. If I don't know what they're going to do, then that person might get hurt because I hold on to the leg lock too long. Like quite commonly when you're rolling with someone and they don't know much about leg locks and you get a heel hook on them or whatever, you better be prepared to let go of that because they might do something really stupid in a second. You have to know predictable responses to be effective in jiu-jitsu, but also in a learning environment for other people to keep people safe from themselves. You need to also be aware of predictable responses.
Yeah, that's a good point. Not all predictable responses lead to good jiu-jitsu. Like there's a lot of predictable responses that come from lack of experience, but there's also a lot of predictable responses that honestly would be effective in a real fight, but due to the rules, we don't do them. Mostly I'm thinking around things like slamming, right? Or even striking. And these are things where if all you train is jiu-jitsu and you train that extensively, you run the risk of creating habits that might not necessarily work in a real fight simply because you're so used to, you've trained your predictable responses within the rules. So I always suggest that when you're training, regardless of what exactly you're training for, whether it be like sport jiu-jitsu or self-defense or MMA or just fun, I would suggest that even if you aren't training with these, these like banned techniques, that you still be aware of them and make sure that whatever you're doing will counter them. Like a good example is if you're going from arm bars or triangles from the bottom, you need to know that getting picked up and slammed or getting spiked on your head is an option. Yeah. And even if your partner is nice enough to not do it to you, you need to know how to defend that. And actually, you should probably work that into your armbar, your submission strategy. And similarly, don't expect that your opponent knows that these things are banned because sometimes, I remember one time I was sparring with a white belt and I had him in like a triangle and he said like, "Hey, check it out. I've got the best defense for this." And he just tried to slam me. He doesn't necessarily know that that's not legal, right? It actually, to be fair, it isn't totally obvious that it would be illegal. Why is it allowed to like uchimata someone onto their face, but not allowed to slam them from a triangle? I actually don't know. It doesn't really make that much sense when you think about it. So you have to be understanding of the fact that sometimes predictable responses can hurt your development if they close your mind to certain possibilities.
Yeah, absolutely. But, if you're training for jiu-jitsu for the street, then you should be doing berimbolos, guys. Come on.
Speaking of unusual jiu-jitsu applications, I wonder if Stefan Kesting is still alive. I mean, I do see his posts on Facebook, but I'm not sure if they're like scheduled or not.
Yeah, for those of you guys that don't know, Stefan Kesting is currently on a canoeing trip in northern Canada.
He's on a 1,000-mile solo canoe journey. And didn't he just get like married too or something?
I think so. And now I think he's being put out to pasture.
So he's doing his honeymoon by himself, as far as I can tell. Have fun, Stefan.
Yeah, I hope you're still alive.
Okay, so hopefully that's a pretty comprehensive discussion around what these things are. Maybe, Matt, we could give some more concrete examples of like what are some common exploits that you can use in terms of predictable responses.
Well, I think one of the more sequences that are pretty familiar, no matter what your jiu-jitsu background is from the closed guard, the Kimura, triangle, armbar, omoplata sequence, right? Like these are all moves that are very much related. They can all be done from a closed guard situation, and usually attacking one will create a defense that opens up something else. So finding certain submissions or submission systems that flow into the other and are what we refer to as technique chaining. You're going to be able to go, like one of the ones that I go for a lot of the times, I'll shoot up a triangle, my opponent will defend, and then I'll be able to switch to an armbar just by pivoting my hips behind their elbow, right? So it's one of my favorite moves, and as long as I am technically sound and that I'm breaking their alignment the entire way and making sure that they can't posture, then I know there's a pretty good chance that I'm going to get that armbar. But let's say they manage to bail and turn out, who knows, there might be an omoplata there that leads to me, that's left for me. Then what's the next sequence? Well, they're probably going to try and roll out of the omoplata, so I need to know how to re-roll. I need to know how to maintain broken alignment of my opponent while I maintain the omoplata position, and then from there, who knows where that technique will go. So it really is an infinite thing of building sequences and putting different systems together. Yeah,
I think the old closed guard submission chain there is probably the best known example of how predictable responses and technique chaining can help you. The armbar, the triangle, and the omoplata play so well off of each other, and the cross choke as well, which is something that people often don't forget to add into that equation. For me, a lot of the time from closed guard, I will fake a scissor sweep or something, but I'll do so with my knee in front of the guy's arm. And when he goes to post, I'll use that to throw up a triangle. Or I'll go for a bump sweep, which is I personally find hard to get. And then when he bases, I'll grab his arm and omoplata him on the way down. So I know a lot of people prefer the triangle from there, but I do like omoplatas.
Yeah, and you notice that like if you're training with people who know those sequences, they rarely get caught in them. Right? I have one guy in my school that I would get that bump sweep triangle on a lot, and now it's never there because he knows that I'm going to go for that move, and he'll actually leave traps for me. Like he'll posture really heavy up in the open guard, and then when I go to bump sweep, he'll hip sprawl, and there's no way I can bump sweep him. So for that second he's opened my guard up, and he starts to look to pass using that. So one of the things I find it's so hard to pass a really good close guard is I'm waiting for them to open their legs, almost letting them go for an attack. And hope, and if they take the bait, awesome, they've opened their legs, and I can now exploit the fact that they've broken their own kinetic chain and try and escape the guard. But a lot of the times really good guard players won't open their guard unless they break your alignment or they switch their hip angles or whatever. So
yeah, those are the most frustrating types of closed guard players, where they keep shuffling their hips and pulling you back down, and you just can't even get them to uncross their ankles.
Exactly.
Like, that is not many people play that anymore, but it is so frustrating when someone's good at that.
Yeah, it is really annoying. And we've discussed submission sequences from the closed guard, but we could also totally go in another direction and discuss, let's say like in judo, the whole ashiwaza game or foot sweeping technique game, like your ochigari or ko-ochigari, dashi-barai. These are all different trips and techniques using the feet in judo, and you'll notice this is one of the big differences I find between wrestling a judo person and wrestling a wrestler. Is the judo fighters will come up more strong postured, like straight up and down, usually leaving them susceptible to shots, but also playing more of the foot tripping game, trying to get you off balance and creating reactions where they can ideally throw you or trip you. So trying to shift your center of gravity in different ways. And this is also another concept that happens when, let's say, you're playing De La Hiva from the bottom. You always want to move your opponent's center of gravity in different directions. And then usually as they're recomposing their base in a direction, that's where you can exploit it and take them over for a sweep or, go for a back take or whatever you're going to do. So really, center of gravity is also something, not just a submission-based sequence of attack, but a breaking of base, center of gravity based attack.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of the time with predictable responses, when you attack one move, your opponent to defend has to compensate by placing their weight in one direction or posting on one side.
It's that natural reaction that you were mentioning earlier.
Yeah,
Steve.
and that's the situation there where it's going to open up a window somewhere else. And the mistake that a lot of people make is they try that one move and the guy posts or bases and they just give up and then they reset. Whereas what you should do is immediately move to attack something where the space is opened up now. That's really the best way to go forward, and that's how you exploit these predictable responses. It's funny, we were talking about the bump sweep earlier. The bump sweep is a move where, from my experience, almost all of the time, it's a fake out. Like, very rarely do people, I find, actually succeed at getting the bump sweep, but people use that to set up something else. So you've got to be super careful when your opponent is trying to bump sweep you, because normally they're not necessarily going for the bump sweep. They're trying to get you to put your hand somewhere that you don't want it to be. Mm-hmm. There are other examples too. Like if you're mounted on someone and they shell up and they bring their hands up and you can't pull an arm free, you can't get at their neck. A lot of the time, what I like to do from there is like fake out an Americana and just push down on one of their arms, because even if I don't think I'm going to get that move, it forces them to then move, and then suddenly there's a bit more space than there was before. So it's something that I've seen a lot of instructors teach as a counter to that, where if your opponent is they're totally shelled up when you're mounted on top of them, sometimes attacking an Americana is a good first step, because even if you're not going to get it, a lot of the time your opponent will adapt by turning to their side and bringing their other arm into play, and now there's space to move. So it's a good setup to get into, like if you want to go up to like a jockey mount or something, or you want to switch to an armbar. Going for an Americana for mount is a good example of how you can create a predictable response.
Yeah.
Cool. In terms of predictable responses too, a big part of this is when you are going for a submission. The nice thing about going for submissions is most of them have a relatively small set of predictable responses, right? Most submissions have maybe 3 or so well-known escapes. The mistake a lot of people make is they're not prepared for those. So what I like to do when I'm teaching people how to do a submission is I make sure that not only do I teach them the submission, but I teach them the predictable responses to it. And then I explain what you have to do to mitigate those, right? Mm-hmm. So like if you're arm barring someone, I mean, from my perspective, probably the most predictable responses are some attempt at a stack, some attempt at a hitchhiker, or some attempt at, I don't exactly know what you call it, but the escape where kind of you get your head back in and then you sit on the guy's leg.
Oh, like you bridge onto his leg? Yeah,
you bridge onto his leg. I've heard that called the rooftop escape, but I don't know if that's the correct name.
And you can pretty much guarantee that they're going to try and create a kinetic chain by linking their hands together, clasping their hands in some way.
That's almost guaranteed. Yeah. Or at the very least, they'll grab their gi. So once you know that, the mistake that a lot of people make is they go for the arm bar, but they're not ready for one of these things. So, in the simplest case, the person grabs their hands and they have no answer to that, right? And a lot of the time, like a monkey with their hand in the cookie jar, they're so close to a submission that they're unwilling to let it go or move on or advance for fear of losing it. So they've got tunnel vision. But a lot of the time, what you have to understand is you have created a predictable response in your opponent. So everyone should have a series of, and I'm not going to get into them here because there's so many different options, but when your opponent clasps their hands like that, everyone should drill and have a few strategies for how to defeat that situation, right? And that's something that, alternately, if there is a common escape like the hitchhiker, everyone needs to know how you need to position yourself to block that, right? And really it comes down to effectively controlling the far shoulder. We talked about this in the Double Trouble episode, where the rotation comes from the ability for the guy to move his far his far shoulder or his far hip joint. So if you want to block the hitchhiker, that's when you either pinch or cross your ankles on the far side. And if you don't have a good enough pinch, you're probably going to lose the armbar.
Yeah, and this is why the mat time really does help, because every time you train, you're basically programming your mind, and incrementally, you can't learn it all at once. Incrementally, you build this experience by sort of, throughout all your roles, you realize what your opponents are going to do for certain attacks, how are they going to react, and then you can, just continuously, incrementally build on that every time. So really, every time you're training, you're programming your mind to recognize these these attacks.
Yeah, it's that whole incremental learning thing again. You can't learn everything in one go. So a lot of the time, the first thing you need to learn is what the move is and the mechanics of why it works. And then the second thing you need to learn is what are the predictable responses to that move. And then from there, you can start to get creative and add or subtract elements to accommodate your game.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So, Matt, is there anything else that you want to talk about in terms of predictable responses? Any examples that you want to give or any other principles that we haven't discussed?
I think we went over pretty comprehensively some submission-based examples, some standing takedown-based examples, and how it all pertains to alignment. So I think that's pretty good. And please, guys, let us know what you think of this episode. And also, if you have maybe some other examples of predictable responses, we'd love to keep hearing from you guys.
Yeah, I definitely love to hear about any, especially kind of generally universal predictable responses that you guys want to talk about. Please do. Feel free to chime in and share your knowledge so that we can broadcast it out there to all of the other listeners. Another point, Matt, that we discussed prior to the show, which I think is worth mentioning, is there always is a response. There is no such thing as a move where there is no counter. There's no escape. There's always an escape. So this is important to understand because, people get frustrated because sometimes, people keep getting out of my moves. But in reality, there is always an escape, and nothing is so guaranteed and so foolproof that it's going to work 100% of the time. If there were, that would be the only thing we'd ever train, right? There would be no need to learn anything else if something worked 100% of the time. So,
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, so really when you're doing jiu-jitsu, the goal is not to get to a position where you're 100% certain that something's going to work. It's to advance your alignment and reduce your opponents, because every time you do that, their odds of success go down just a little bit. And if you can continually do that, then you can increase the probability that you're going to win. It's all just a game of math.
Yeah, and you just want to, like you said, you don't want to be that guy that is always saying, what if, like when you're showing a technique, there's always that lower rank guy in class. What if I do this? What if I do this?
What if I bite you?
Yeah. What if I do this? It's like, yeah, well, there's always going to be a what if. That's why the what if question is kind of silly because, for example, if your professor is showing a technique and you think, well, that won't work because I would just do this. It's like, you're actually not even thinking about it, but you're coming up with predictable responses, and your defense might be legit in that attack, but the point of your instructor showing the technique isn't to say this is always going to work. This is something that my opponent can't react in any way. It's just a technique, and then of course there's going to be a predictable response. There's going to be several predictable responses. So the what if guy kind of sounds like a tool in the end, and usually a lesser experienced guy that doesn't understand the idea of predictable responses yet.
Yeah, well, but that's not to say you should never ask what if, because a big part of learning a move is learning those predictable responses. But you also shouldn't be surprised to learn that your instructor is teaching you something that might fail. Like everything might fail. So you want to learn those predictable responses. From my perspective, it's fine to ask what if, but don't be surprised if if there's a hole in this technique.
Yeah,
every technique has a way out.
Definitely you need to know the what ifs. Let me rephrase that. You do need to know the what ifs, but you don't want to be that guy that thinks that he's got all the answers to, or that a technique isn't legitimate because I would just do this or whatever, because then you start to sound like an ass. So You're right.
So actually that whole conversation about the odds of mathematically reducing your opponent's chances of success, that's a Rob Bernanke thing, actually. I think he talks about it in the BJJ Formula DVDs. So if you want to learn more about his philosophy, he kind of covers it there. But the important thing to know is that nothing is foolproof, especially in jiu-jitsu. When I started training, I thought, I want to get to the point where, I'm confident I can win every fight. And then I realized as I got older, what I actually want is to never get into a fight, because nothing is predictable in a fight.
That's also very true.
That's the one thing you really learn after training for a long time is you never, ever want to get into a real fight, because it is so unpredictable as to what could actually happen.
Yeah, with factors that we don't even think about in the gym.
Lava, syringes, drunk friends, bears. Okay, so just to recap what we talked about today in terms of the mental models discussed, we talked about predictable responses, meaning stimulating your opponent so that they react in a way that you expect and you can predict, and that way you don't have to think ahead of time. You know what they're going to do, hopefully before they even do it. We talked about dictating the pace, the importance of being the one who is active rather than reactive in a fight. We talked about form to leave form, which is the Josh Waitzkin principle, meaning you want to drill things to the point where you don't need to think about them anymore, because if you have to think about something, it gives your opponent an opportunity to take over control of the fight. We talked about funneling, meaning the strategy of progressively removing your opponent's options and forcing them down a road that plays into your game rather than into theirs. I actually think we probably want to have a whole episode on that at some point, because that's so crucial to game planning, is how do you get your opponent into the game that is beneficial for you but not for them. Mm-hmm. We talked about technique chaining, the idea that single techniques in isolation rarely work, but combinations of techniques will progressively break your opponent's alignment. We talked about masking your intentions, meaning that if your opponent knows what you're going to do because you've telegraphed it, you are providing a predictable response to your opponent, and they can then exploit that, and it makes it a lot harder for you to succeed at any particular strategy. We talked about controlled breathing and staying loose. These are two biological predictable responses where your body can betray you if it's not trained to control itself in a stressful situation. And we talked about incremental learning, the idea that you can't learn everything all at once. So you need to be, as an instructor especially, but even as a student, you need to know what it is that you need to know now, and you need to practice that to the point where you see the limitations of your knowledge and start to get frustrated by them. And that's when you're ready for the next piece. Trying to overload people with information all at one go rarely works.
Yeah, that was very good, Steve.
So let's talk about balls.
So we have an interesting question actually from one of my guys, and he said, Matt, whenever I really like doing arm bars, but whenever I go for armbar, I always end up crushing my balls. Why does this happen, and how can I prevent this from happening? So it's a really good question. I think a lot of people this happens to, and when I first started doing jiu-jitsu, armbar was one of my favorite moves. One of the first moves that I really started focusing on, and I could hit consistently on someone. And it happened to me. You would, sometimes it's totally fine, you get the armbar, and then other times you would go for the armbar, and like as you're finishing, you're kind of squeezing your testicle, and it still sometimes rarely happens, but it is a real thing, right? So how can you armbar someone without crushing your balls? So you had what was your answer, Steve?
So from my standpoint, I think this happens to everybody, or at least everybody who's male and trains. We've all been there.
You mean that doesn't happen to females?
I actually honestly don't know if there's, presumably women have similar issues, right?
I'd imagine.
I would imagine. I mean, maybe not that particular type, but I would imagine that chest to chest pressure can have totally different implications, right? It's the kind of thing where, you've got a weak spot. You've got an easily exploited weak spot. Now, luckily, the rules don't allow your opponent to exploit that, but that doesn't mean you might not hurt yourself somehow. So in terms of how I like to deal with this, the big thing is a lot of the time people, they focus a lot on how important it is to pinch their ankles, which is important, but it's also extremely important to pinch your knees together. For a long time, I was so hell-bent on pinching my ankles into my opponent that I wasn't even thinking about pinching my knees together, because you're not trying to, you shouldn't have your opponent's elbow right on your pelvis, right? That is not ideal. You want to prevent the arm from getting down that low so that you get more leverage. So if you pinch your knees together, then you can kind of trap your opponent's elbow between your thighs. And if you have a good pinch, it shouldn't get further down than that. The other mistake that people make a lot is they wait until the arm bar is set up and then they pinch their knees. And at that point, it's too late because the guy's arm is already right up against your groin. So really what I find is important is as soon as you get the guy's elbow trapped between your legs, you immediately pinch your knees together. That way, when you start to set up the arm bar and you start to progressively lock it on, it's not going to sink any deeper than it already is. It's going to stay right where you want it to be. So my general advice is remember to pinch your knees, and don't wait until you've got the armbar to pinch your knees. Pinch your knees as soon as the guy's arm is between your legs.
Yeah, that's pretty good advice. My advice was, let's say you're doing an armbar from the closed guard. That was sort of my favorite position to hit it from, would be closed guard. And in doing this, if you do a big swing with your leg coming over your opponent's head, that's when I found there was a lot of space to actually get your testicles jammed up in between your legs and your opponent's arm. So now when I do my arm bars and I'm shifting my hips out to the side like that, I'm thinking about doing this while placing wedges behind my opponent's shoulders. This keeps them more trapped, it breaks their posture more, and it also makes a smaller transition when you're throwing your leg over their head. So that is something that really helped me, was I tried to not do such big movements when I bring my leg over my opponent's head. And then the other thing was, let's say I did get my leg over my opponent's head and I'm sweeping them and we're in like the spider web position now. So I think a lot of people, especially when they're newer and maybe they don't understand lever mechanics, is they think that the key to finishing the armbar is to use their arms to pull down as hard as they can and bridge up as hard as they can. This really will like make your groin a more, I don't know what to say, prominent fulcrum point.
You're basically using your pelvis as the fulcrum, which is the problem, right? That's what you don't necessarily want to do that.
Yeah, so more importantly, you want to think about the wedges that you're applying around your opponent's arm, head, and shoulders. So instead of trying to rip the arm off with your arms and hipping in as hard as you can, it's more important to think about how your legs are pinching, like Steve was talking about, pinching your knees together, really isolating and immobilizing the near shoulder, and even the far shoulder will give you more control. And then that's going to give you, usually I find it protects my balls more, and I'm not arm barring my opponent's arm directly onto my junk. I'm using, like you said, your legs pinching. And with those tips, that should help you a little bit more. And if you need more understanding on lever mechanics, I think we have a whole episode on levers that we've discussed, and and also on finishing submissions with lever-based attacks. Yeah. So, and also just a side note, when I finish arm bars, something that Rob showed me that's really cool is, instead of trying to pull the hand down towards the ground, pulling it away from the body and down so that there's less slack in the joint is something that I found really amplifies the finishing mechanics of the arm bar as well.
Yeah, and another thing to bear in mind too is that not all arm bars are finished just by like you're perpendicular to the guy, your shoulders are on the mat, and you pull his arm straight back. Sometimes, there are variants of the armbar where maybe you're on your side or you're turned a little bit. But the important thing is you just want to have a fulcrum behind the guy's elbow, and you want to pull back in that direction. So if it is really, really a problem that you just can't overcome, then there are variants of the armbars that operate at a slightly different angle that you can look into. I mean, sometimes for certain body types, certain moves just don't work comfortably. So, just bear in mind with the armbar, there are variants of it, particularly the angled ones that might help. But of course, the other option is you can just load up on steroids, and then eventually your balls will shrink to the point where this isn't a problem for you. So that's also on the table.
And if you're not doing steroids, you're basically saying, I don't want an even playing field.
No comment. Actually, while we're on this conversation, now that I'm thinking about it, I would be interested to know if our female listeners have any similar female type issues. Is there an equivalent to the age-old I crushed my balls doing the armbar question that women have to deal with? Because we could definitely look into that and ask around. I'm wondering if maybe there is such a similar thing.
Yeah, possibly.
Yeah. Let us know.
It's a shallower fulcrum point, so...
Well, who knows? Anyway, that was BJJ Mental Models, episode 31. Hope that was helpful to everybody. And as always, we do look for questions, comments, suggestions for future episodes. Matt loves it when you argue with him on YouTube, so feel free to just talk trash to him there.
And criticize my DVD.
Yeah, criticize his DVD.
This would never work in the street.
He's really salty.
You people.
He's really salty about that. So if you want to go there and just prod him a little bit...
I'm definitely not salty. I laugh that people still say that.
He says that this is the fourth consecutive week where you've complained about this, so I think maybe there's something there.
I'm sure someone has baramboloed someone in the street.
Yeah, hey, if you've got a street fight video that you found floating around on WorldStar where someone barambolos someone else, send it to us. I want to see it.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. We'll talk to you next week.
See you guys.
Bye.